Be nice.
Okay. We left off with chapter 11. We had covered up through verse 9. And we're going to finish up chapter 11 tonight, begin from verse 10 down through verse 32. Now, if you're looking at that and notice, oh, gee, this is one of those, this guy begat that guy, how boring can we get? I will say this much, this particular passage of Scripture is not the most exciting one in the world, but as we look into this, there's some interesting information behind the scenes that we're going to draw out from this. So maybe by the time we're done with this, that you'll find that this genealogy or the Toledot not be quite as boring. All right, now.
Pronouncing that wrong.
Toledo T. Okay. Now this is going to be a dry whiteboard night. Now, it says these are the records of the generations of Shem. Now notice first off, Moses already covered Ham and Japheth. He saves the most important one for last because, of course, we know Shem is the ancestor of the Messianic line. And this whole section basically traces the genealogy from Shem down to Abraham. And of course, on Sunday, we're going to look at what's called the Abrahamic covenant, where God picks Abraham out of the bunch and pretty much tells Abraham, you're the one that I've chosen, and I'm going to bless the world through you. Now it says, these are the records of the generation of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. So this is what we want to look at.
He was 98 years old when the flood came?
He was 98. Which is also another reason we know Shem was not the oldest. Because if you compare the ages and what have you, you'll find it was Japheth, Shem, and then Ham. But he was basically, he had his first kid 2 years after the flood. Now, not really concerned so much with where verse 11 says Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arpachshad. He had other sons and daughters. So, we do know that at this point, he lived to be how much altogether? Well, said he's 100 years old, became the father of Arpachshad, then lived 500 after that, so 600. So we're just going to kind of put this off to the side. Keep in mind, Shem lived to be 600 years old. Now, it says, Arpachshad lived 35 years, became the father of Shelah. Notice right off the bat what has changed immediately after the flood that's not consistent with before.
Bearing children at a much younger age.
Oh yeah, much younger age. Before they were living to be 100, 200, 300 years old before they had a kid. Now we're seeing that they're having them, right here we see this guy was 35. So we have the second generation, 35 years. Then verse 14, Shelah lived 30 years, became the father of Eber. So now we got another 30. Then Eber lived to be 34, became the father of Peleg. Now, what happened during the time of Peleg?
The land was divided.
Land was divided. So how much time from the flood to the time well, we don't know this is when the land was divided. It just says it was during his days. So the earliest it could have happened was, somebody want to add this up?
67 years would have been when he was born.
Mm-hmm.
101 years would...
101. 35, 30, 34, and 2 from the flood. So that comes out 101 years, right? All right. Well, Just going to kind of put this all.
But the beginning of his days was at 67.
No, you're reading it wrong. Shem had his first kid, 2 years after the flood, which was
Peleg
Arpachshad.
wasn't born till 101. That's okay. I got it.
Now you
So
tried
his
it.
days started at 101 years after the flood.
101 years after the flood was when Peleg was born. We're going to kind of put that out to the side. 101. Now, then, verse 18. Peleg lived 30 years and became the father of Roy. So now we add another 30. Peleg lived 209 years after he became the father of Roy. So, his lifespan was what altogether?
239.
239. So we've got from 101 up to, what did you say, 239? So 240 years. So somewhere between 101, what's that?
340. 239 and 101.
Okay, you're right. 340. All right, somewhere between 101 years and 340 years after the flood is when God said that he moved or divided the earth. So that gives you a time frame from all of the land or the people to begin multiplying. Of course, they congregated at the Tower of Babel and then spread out. So he didn't give them a lot of time. All right, now, Roy lived 32 years, became the father of Sarah. So 32. Then Sarah lived 30 years, became the father of Nahor. By the way, does anybody know who Nahor is? Nahor is Abraham's father. That he became, what's that?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nahor lived 29 years and became the father of Terah. All right, so we put 29.
Grandfather, not father.
Okay, grandfather, yeah. Father, yeah, you're right. Nahor's his grandfather. Terah's his father. Terah lived 70 years. This is the first one that's actually waited that long. 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. He had 3 kids. All right, so we have 70. All right. Somebody total all that up. You want to make it easy, start off at 101 and then add those.
$191 added to 101.
191, so that's 292.
191 on the bottom group.
All right. So I'm saying, so all that together, the total then is 292, right? All right. So, 292 years from the flood to the birth of Abram. Now, right off the bat, do you see anything interesting here? Shem lived to be 600.
Shem was still alive.
Shem was still alive. Exactly. Abram was born only 292 years after the flood. Shem lived 500 years after the flood. So Shem was a middle-aged man when Abram was born. Now, why is this important, and why do I even point that out? We do not know this specifically. In fact, we can't prove it. But there are other Jewish sources. You know, things like the Mishnah and various Jewish commentaries and things of that sort. There are a lot of Jewish scholars that believe that Melchizedek was Shem. Because, of course, what does the Bible tell us about Melchizedek?
He is the oldest living.
He's a king.
No, you're thinking of Methuselah.
Oh, they were cousins.
No wonder the other end dies.
He had no history, and he didn't have a beginning, didn't have an end.
So he was in
Was
the
a king
witness
and a
protection
priest.
program.
Yeah.
He was king of Salem, which, by the way, the city of Salem. Now, it's easier to actually see this in the Hebrew. And I know you're thinking Hebrew. I don't know. The word Salem in Hebrew is actually pronounced shalom. And everybody in here knows what the word shalom means, right? It means peace. So, if Melchizedek was the king of Salem, he was, what's his title?
The King of Peace.
He was the king of peace, which is also the reason why the writer of Hebrews tells us that Christ practiced his priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, not the order of Aaron. He's the king of priests. Also, the name Melchizedek, it's literally Melchizedek. Melchi means priest, or excuse me, Melchi means king. And when you put two words together in Hebrew, that's a possessive. Just like if I say Merrill coffee, that literally in Hebrew would be the coffee of Merrill. All right. Well, actually, I got the backwards, but you get the idea. There is no word of in Hebrew, or there's no possessive. You just put the two nouns together, and it's called a construct, which basically means it's a possessive. So to have Melchi, which means king, and Zedek, which is the Hebrew word for righteousness, that literally means the king of righteousness. So right off the bat, we have Melchizedek, who is the king of peace. His name is King of Righteousness. And while we have not gotten that far yet, that's still a couple of chapters later when we'll go into more detail about this. Abraham, after he went out and went to war with his buddies and defeated those who had kidnapped his wife, Lot, and all his servants, he went and whooped up on them, got all of them back. And do you remember what was the first thing he did when he got back home?
He made a tithe to Melchizedek.
He tithed to Melchizedek. Now, the interesting thing is, at this point in history, it is believed that there were Canaanites, actually specifically they were called the Jebusites, who were a pagan group of people that lived in what became the city of Jerusalem. It was still called the city of Shalom at the time. It got renamed Jerusalem later on down the line. But Melchizedek himself was not a pagan. Clearly, he was a priest of God. In fact, the Bible even tells us he was a priest of God Almighty. Or actually it says El Elyon, which means literally God Most High. And Melchizedek came out to meet Abraham as Abraham's returning, and Abraham tithed the tenth of everything that he had, or everything that he brought back, all the increase from this battle that he just had, gave it to Melchizedek. And of course, as Bruce just mentioned, the Bible tells us nothing of Melchizedek, not where he's from, not what his family is, nothing. But there is a lot of basically what we call extra biblical sources, basically Jewish commentaries and some Jewish legends. The Jews believed that Melchizedek was probably Shem. And look at the names there. What does the name Shem mean? Name. And he was the ancestor of the name. So there is a strong theological possibility that Shem may in fact have been Melchizedek. Also, keep in mind that when Melchizedek came out to meet him, we're not told this specifically, but just from the context of the passage, which again we'll look at here in a couple of weeks, it seems to me that Abraham knew who Melchizedek was.
Didn't he bow to him or something?
It sure enough did.
The lesser bows to the greater.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder, if in fact the legend that Shem was Melchizedek may very well be accurate. Now again, I'm not telling you that we know for a fact that that's the case. I'm just telling you there's strong evidence to indicate that he may have been, and the Jews certainly believe it.
So Shem was Abraham's great grandfather.
Well, I didn't count them all up, but something like that.
That seems bizarre to have, that
Wow,
many
that
generations
many
alive
greats.
together at once.
It would be to us, but not.
Yeah.
I've heard that Melchizedek could have been the manifestation of Jesus.
That's been said, but it's, I would say, unlikely, because the Bible makes it very clear that the incarnation did not occur until Mary became pregnant with Jesus. Jesus appeared from time to time
Well, that's kind of what I meant.
As the angel of the Lord.
as the
But
angel
not
of
as
the
a
Lord,
man.
but not as a man.
Well,
There's no
Didn't he appear to Abraham, and Abraham begged him to save the wicked cities? Wasn't one of those Jesus?
He did, but also keep in mind that when Jesus and the two angels that were attending him appeared to Abram, or of course by that point he was Abraham, there's something rather interesting about that interaction, which is this: Abraham knew immediately when he saw them that they were not mere men. I mean, Abraham wanted to worship and wanted to provide a sacrifice, which tells me Abraham took one look at him and knew that who he was. If Jesus was appearing in some incarnate form, some physical form, be questionable as to whether that would have taken place. For example, when Jesus indeed was incarnated, people didn't immediately know that that's who he was. It had to be revealed to them. So yeah, there's some people that believe that, but not a lot of evidence for it.
Okay.
What?
Nothing. I'm awake. I
You're
promise.
awake?
I'm awake.
All right. So we see that Shem not only was alive when Abraham came onto the scene, but he still had about another, I'd say, couple hundred years of life in him after that. All right, now, on down to verse 29. Well, actually, go back to verse 27. We'll pick up there. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Now keep in mind, Terah was Abraham's father, and Abraham had two brothers. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, don't confuse the two Nahors. Nahor was Terah's father, and so obviously he named one of his sons after his father. So we're talking two different Nahors here. And Haran became the father of Lot. Now, what was interesting about Haran?
He died before his father.
There you go. Haran died at an early age, which is why Abraham, when he and his father took off headed towards Canaan, by the way, when this happened originally, Abraham did not head for Canaan alone. He not only had Lot with him, which he was taking care of Lot because Lot was an orphan, but he also was going there with his father Terah. Terah just didn't make it. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. Now, by the way, Ur of the Chaldeans is believed to be where today would be southern Iraq. And Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. So Haran did have more than one kid. He had more than just Lot. Had some daughters in there, but he left them all behind. Now, what do you notice immediately about Abram's relationship with Sarai? He married his niece. Or excuse me, not his niece, his half-sister. She was his half-sister. Abram and Nahor, the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Yeah, Sarai apparently was, and I guess really, well, I asked you this, but it actually hasn't revealed that yet, I don't think.
His niece.
Yeah, no, not yet. It was his half-sister. Abram and Nahor took wives to themselves. The name of Abram's wife is Sarai. The name of Nahor's wife is Milcah, the daughter of Haran, father of Milcah and Iscah. You know, Sarai's not mentioned yet.
Oh, Milcah's the niece.
Milcah's the niece.
Okay.
Sarai was barren, she had no child, and Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, Sarai's daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. Now, you see, this is before God has actually spoken to Abraham. They've decided as a family to head off in that direction. Now, whether or not God has actually spoken to them at this point and told them to go that far, we don't know. The Bible is silent. We can't prove one way or the other if the first time God or that Abram heard from God was later, or if they have already heard from him. All we know is that when Abram first struck out for Canaan, he wasn't alone. It's not just Lot and his wife. He's with his father. Because culturally back then, as long as the father was alive, even though you were an adult child, it was customary that you stayed with your family until the family patriarch died. So as long as Terah was alive, Abram was culturally bound to follow his father. Now it says they went as far as Haran. Now let me mention this. I know you see that one of Terah's sons, the youngest one, is named Haran, and it said they went to a place called Haran. In English, it looks like that it's the same name, but in Hebrew, it's actually spelled different. One is, the name of the son was Haran, and the name of the city was Haran, with a sort of a CH sound. Two different names, but for some reason, the English translators have spelled them the same, which I find confusing because it's not the same name in Hebrew.
Oh. In thinking that it was the same name, it occurred to me that perhaps they named the place where they settled after the son who had died.
No, it was that name before they got there. And again, different spelling. But says they went to Haran, or Haran, as it's in Hebrew, and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, we're not going to go any farther than that tonight because we're going to probably finish a little early this evening.
205 years is a much shorter lifespan. It's
Much
already
shorter.
starting to drop.
Yeah, because we've got a little, we're going to sit and talk about this for a little bit before we go on to chapter 12 on Sunday. Now, we have no indication at this point that God has spoken to Abram. I mean, yes, it's possible, but you got to ask, why were they going to a place they'd never been to before? Now, how do we know that none of them had ever been to Canaan before? Even though it says they were going to Canaan. Because you remember in chapter 12, which I realize we haven't read this yet, but all of you in here have read it before. What was peculiar about Abram express his faith in God? God told him he was going to send him where?
To a land of milk and honey.
Well, not just that, but to a place he'd never been before. And we see that in chapter 12, that God was calling Abram to go somewhere he'd never been before, said, you just got to trust me. So even though they may or may not have heard of the land, they definitely had never been there before. And that their family was from, again, this place called Ur. Now, if you look on a map, they actually got there the long way. To go from Ur to the city of Haran was actually northwest along the Euphrates River. Excuse me, Tigris River. They went northwest along the Tigris River. Then they would have had to cross the river and then turned and gone southwest to go from there to get to Canaan. And it wasn't just, like from here to Lake City. You're talking a distance of several hundred miles and an area they'd never been to before. So if at this point God has not spoken to them, why would they have wanted to strike out to this area when they'd never been there?
They could have had land availability they didn't have back in Ur.
See, that's the issue there, is by this point, they were already becoming wealthy, and Canaan was known for having good pasture land. So either they went there to take, because of the family was getting well off and had a lot of livestock, or God had, even though the Bible doesn't tell us this, and again, keep in mind that because the Bible doesn't tell us, doesn't mean that it didn't happen. The possibility is there that God may have already spoken to them and told Terah and Abram, this is the direction I want you to go. And the reason that chapter 12 would then have relayed God actually speaking to Abram is because at that point, God didn't just speak to Abram and tell him where he wanted him to go. God established a covenant with him. And it's actually referred to as the Abrahamic covenant, which is the covenant that essentially God promised that the Messiah would come through him. But I found it all interesting in looking later on down the line after Abram settled in Canaan. And by the way, we noticed this interaction with Melchizedek did not occur early on. Because as we'll see in chapter 12, after they got there, they stopped for a while, they built an altar, they worshiped God, but then a famine began, which tells us they were there probably for at least a season, and then went on south into Egypt, stayed in Egypt long enough to get themselves into trouble, then turned around and went back to Canaan. And it's after that, when they got back to Canaan and settled there, then they got, into an entanglement with the other kings of the various cities. And by the way, back then, there were very few empires or countries. A lot of these places, and Canaan was one of them, every city or every settlement essentially had its own government. It was its own little small kingdom. When we think of empires like the Egyptian empire, the Hittite empire, that of Babylonia, which by the way did not exist yet, and places like that, most of the areas of the world, that kind of government had not yet emerged. It was all a bunch of little settlements because, again, think of the calendar. We're only looking at about 300 or 400 years after the flood.
And the scattering.
And the scattering, which would have been even less than that.
And Abraham was born 48 years before Peleg died. So it was right around the time or just prior to Abraham's birth that the separation of the land had become completed. I've said before, I've read accounts by Christian geologists that said that if it had been done slowly over the course of 100 years or more, it could have been done in a way that didn't cause great tsunamis and earthquakes, and that period of 101 to 340 is a perfect timeline for that to happen. 200 years.
Consider this, and
so the people had just recently been scattered, and the languages had just recently been confused around the time that Abraham was born.
Which also consider this possibility. If word began to spread that the land masses were separating, and if this happened as slowly as we think it might have, word would have gotten around. If God moved the land masses a few miles per year, they'd have had more than ample time for travelers and merchants and things of that, people of that sort to have spread around. It's like, by the way, have you felt these tremors lately? Well, here's what's going on. It's like the land masses are separating. And if that was the case, and Abram's family, including his father and his nephew, if they had heard this and knew that, well, Canaan is a very fertile land and we got a lot of cattle to take care of, and by the way, there's now water developing right close to there, that might have actually given them the incentive that they needed even before God spoke to Abram, to begin traveling in that direction. Now, as to why they settled in Haran and didn't go any further at that point, well, if Terah died there, what does that tell you about him? He probably was getting on up in years, and his health may have gotten to the point that he couldn't travel any further. May have stopped there, and then after his death, then God would have stepped in and said, Abram, you're not settling here. I've got another plan for you. Now, again, a lot of that is speculation, but the reason I point all that out is because if you look at the timeline, it would all have fit at just about that time, during that lifespan of Peleg, when the Bible tells us that the land divided during his lifespan. But you got about, what was it, a 200-year period there, give or take, that this could have occurred. Questions this evening? All right.
The
Sunday.
concept of Melchizedek potentially being Shem is just mind-blowing.
Well, the other issue behind that is Shem would have, by this point, have probably well known, and if he had gone and settled there in Salem, which again would indicate why he was the king, because everybody would have recognized him as the patriarch of everybody, and if they made him the king of the city, it would explain why when Abram got there, even though Abram by this point had a covenant with God, and God had already told Abram that he had been blessed and that the world would be blessed through him, he still would have been willing to defer and to tithe to this Melchizedek if he knew in fact that Melchizedek was one of his ancestors, his great grandfather. Because that would have put Shem in a position of being in authority over him, because
The senior patriarch.
he would have been the senior patriarch. Because of course the only other two patriarchs that would have had been on similar standing would have been Ham and Japheth, but we know they both moved off elsewhere. Shem was the one that remained in that area. So, okay, anyway. Are you just totally bored to death with these genealogies? Well, guess what?
There's more to come.
Well, there will be later on down the line, but starting Sunday, we move on to the covenant.